Right now, I can't tell you whether The English Patient or Secrets and Lies will win the Oscar for Best Film. I can't tell you whether Anthony Minghella or Mike Leigh might triumph as Best Director over the likes of Milos Forman. I don't know whether Brenda Blethyn, Kristen Scott Thomas or Emily Watson will take the honours as Best Actress. I don't even know whether Ralph Fiennes will be considered better than Tom Cruise, Woody Harrelson, Geoffrey Rush or Billy Bob Thornton as Best Actor. What I can tell you, however, is that the best coverage of the ceremony will be on BBC2. Live from Hollywood with not Oscar, but me, Barry Norman, on Tuesday at 2 a.m.
Guess it's time to meet the neighbors.
When a man is lost in space,
I have to reach out to him.
and technology cannot bridge the gap,
There is no more time.
you have to make a choice.
You're too close to this.
Test the outer limits of your imagination, Monday at 9 on BBC2.
Who needs politicians? Jeremy Paxman chairs the debate in tonight's Newsnight special in a couple of minutes. Now on BBC2, Science Week gets closer to brass.
Copper is a common element, but soft. So add some zinc to create brass. Tougher, but still workable. The stuff of brass bands, doorknobs, and a special type of spring. It's made of brass with a little aluminium added. But while most metals simply expand when heated, this spring does the opposite. It's a memory metal. Now it's cold, but heated, and it remembers and changes to another shape. Deep within the structure of the metal, these needles themselves change to another form, squarer and more compact. This spring regulates the temperature of your bath water. Other memory metals are now used in open-heart surgery, eyeglasses, coffee pots, and most brazen of all, a range of underwired bras. Magnified millions of times, a regular lattice of atoms emerges, lined up and ready, remembering how to spring back.
Back for a new series, Black Britain, Under Fire, the true face of army racism.
As far as humiliation was concerned, it was one of the worst experiences I was put through.
Putting on the glitz with veteran dancer Josie Woods. And going home ripped off, the Caribbean property sharks who promised a dream but failed a nightmare.
All we had, we put into it. So now we haven't got anything else.
When news matters, it matters where you get your news. Black Britain, Wednesday, 7:30, BBC2.
The World Figure Skating Championships in just under an hour, where there's British interest in the free dance competition. We'll have action on the ice from 11:25. A Newsnight special now on BBC2 with Jeremy Paxman.
The world whizzes by as politicians posture. Has Parliament, or indeed politicians, got anything relevant to say any longer? Politicians, who needs them? Tonight, as accusations fly back and forth about who gave money, who took money, who knew about taking money, and who lied about taking money, we ask a more profound question. Is there any point in politicians? The power to create jobs lies increasingly with companies which shift their production lines around the world at the drop of a faceless accountant's finger. The power to create life itself lies with scientists who've shown time and again that national parliaments can't stop them. And when politicians use some grand phrase like declaring war on drugs, they fail. The drug culture has reached the point where this man, the head of Interpol, thinks their use should be decriminalized. Esther Dyson believes international communications are creating new social structures where parliaments are irrelevant. Dr. Paul Rainsbury offers parents the chance to choose the sex of their child. Banned in Britain, he'll do it in Saudi Arabia. Edward Luttwak will be joining us. He thinks that in the free market, central bankers have become more powerful than presidents or prime ministers. Ian Angel believes in the end governments are simply impotent. The challenge is to find a socially acceptable way of dismantling democracy, which is one of the reasons George Walden MP, one of Westminster's most creative brains, is throwing in the towel. We've lots of other contributions too, including from 3 politicians who still think the game's worth the candle. Before we get into the debate, let's start with them. Each of you, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to answer this question. Stephen Dorrell, what are you for?
I think that one of the most interesting things that's happened in recent years has been the recognition that the role of politics is much more limited than it used to be. And actually the key thing that politicians are there for is to create a set of rules within society that allows individuals within society to make the best of their own lives.
Right.
It's the individuals who are the key, not the politicians.
Jack Straw, what do you think is the function of politicians?
Well, the function of politicians is to run the political process as representatives. And the best way of explaining that is to explain what happens when the political process breaks down. It has, for example, broken down very profoundly in Israel and Palestine. And what you see there is people trying to resolve conflict by violence. Now, politics, democratic politics, is a far from perfect process. It has and ought to have very severe limitations. But it is a way of, by debate, discussion, of resolving serious conflicts and, as Stephen Dorrell said, of seeking to lay down ground rules, particularly for people's public behaviour.
David Steele, are you convinced that there is still a continuing need for politicians?
Yes, of course. Let's go back to the origin of the word. It's the Greek word polis, the city. And to be a politician is about managing, democratic management of the life of people. And in spite of the events of the last few days, when we may have been let down by a small minority among the number, I still think that to be a politician is a high and noble calling, even though I'm about to leave that profession, and I don't think it should be denigrated. What I think the programme will come on to, I hope, is to discuss the inability of politicians to deal with some of the highly complex issues which your programme is going to discuss.
Absolutely right. It is, of course, this country's boast that it is the mother of parliaments. The scenes today in Westminster bear eloquent witness to the length of its beard, at least. About 40 MPs gathered for the bizarre little ceremony of the prorogation of Parliament, in which people in funny hats paid their respects to the Commons. Small wonder so many of the electorate seem to find the thing pantomimish. It is perhaps partly because they've lost the ability to control their economies that governments are turning their attention increasingly to social policy, crime, the family and drugs. Politicians of all hues agree that drugs are bad. It's political death for any senior figure to say that we might perhaps alter tack, that prohibition hasn't worked. Well, it hasn't. Martha Carney reports now from Liechtenstein, where one person at least has decided politicians may be fighting a losing battle.
Familiar tune, different kingdom. This may look like Ruritania, but Liechtenstein is actually at the forefront of a radical debate over drugs. Today is a big day, the state opening of Parliament. In the tiny tax haven, a crown prince shares power with 25 assembly members. From his 12th century castle, Prince Hans Adam is the first European head of state to advocate the legalization of hard drugs because their use is so widespread.
Seeing them myself at school, I was offered some drugs, and my children have been offered drugs. Luckily they didn't buy it, I didn't have the money to buy them. I think we lost the war on drugs, and we not only lost the war, but I think our drug policy helped very much the mafia to make a huge profits out of the drug business. And I think people start to realize that politicians cannot do everything and that the state cannot do everything.
It's a bit ironic that the head of such an anachronistic institution should come up with these radical ideas. In Britain, publicly at least, politicians maintain that they can win the war on drugs, that they can reverse widespread social trends. But at times it seems as if an entire generation is willing to flout the law, and people are less willing than ever before to listen to politicians, whether it's about marriage, family life, or taking drugs. There's a meticulous search for drugs each night at the Ministry of Sound in South London. For thousands of young people, clubs are the organised face of rave culture, often associated with the drug ecstasy, now the main target for politicians.
You're waiting to pay, could you come round, please?
But the club and the people who go there believe you can't stop drug taking.
The only way they're going to stop the drug is to stop the house music full stop, because an ecstasy tab is going to be generated by the house music itself.
Do you think politicians have the power to stop people taking drugs if they want to?
Not really. I mean, there's always going to be something that people are going to want to do.
Most young people would argue that politicians don't really understand drugs. Young people see ecstasy, for example, as one stage removed from lager, whilst our parents and therefore politicians see it as one stage removed from heroin.
Conservative and Labour governments have tried every political tool against drugs, from dire warnings to outright prohibition. Met with lurid headlines from the tabloids, politicians responded with moralistic parables for the young on the dangers of drugs.
The critical choice will be made. Will the tree grow straight or crooked? Do we let them slide downhill into the slovenly society? Or do we, their elders, set the right standards of behaviour in schools, on television and in public life?
When sermonising failed, politicians got Holland to make ecstasy a controlled drug in the hopes supply would dry up. But it didn't. Last year, Customs seized enough ecstasy for 5 million doses. Then the government cracked down on open-air raves, but the culture moved indoors to clubs instead. Drug deaths increased due to overheating. Now, despite a renewed drive of health education, by the age of 19, half of all teenagers have taken illegal drugs. But politicians still believe in the power of prohibition. Conservative MP Barry Legg, with government backing, has brought in a bill to shut down all clubs where there's evidence of organised drug dealing.
What I'm trying to do is to stop dealers at clubs pushing drugs to young people that have just come there for a good night out.
Do you think politicians really have the power to win the war on drugs?
Yes, they have the power, they have the political will to do that, provided that the country also has the will to tackle the problem of drugs. And I think there has been quite a marked change in public attitudes towards drugs in recent months. People are much more concerned to stamp this out and to make sure that there are effective policies saying no to drugs.
But Labour backbencher Paul Flynn believes that politicians actively do damage by assuming they do have power to control drugs. He's opposed to the Legg bill, though his party backed it.
I think it'll do great harm. It will drive the trade in ecstasy onto the streets, where it's far more likely to be dangerous than it is within the clubs, where there's some kind of control over it now. But the hypocrisy of MPs, these people who are so remote from the life of young people see them as ancient, lecherous, rich, cynical people who are not of this century and not of this planet. And they see politics as a kind of Novocaine for the brain that's spoken in an alien tongue.
A new ad is trying to change that.
Drugs are, I would say, pop music, alluring in standards of all sorts, bad driving.
The Ministry of Sound Votes campaign urges young people to challenge the old order's assumption that it has the power to control their lives.
I think we are foolish if we believe that we can influence things on a profound level. We can push things along by small changes, by a little pressure here, by pushing there. But certainly we don't have the omnipotence that we pretend to have.
But that's a minority view. Ministers still protest they do have power. At the other ministry, there's little time for politicians.
Politicians should go clubbing, shouldn't they? They haven't got it live.
Raymond Kendall, are governments winning the war on drugs?
I would have to say at the moment, I'm a realist but not a defeatist. And I would say that at the moment we are losing the battle, but we haven't lost it.
And you say that as the head of Interpol?
No, I say it because of my experience over many, many years of seeing what happens in many, many countries in relation to the policies that are being applied. And what I would say is that clearly there's an imbalance between the totally prohibitive approach and the necessary complement which we do need in terms of reducing demand and dealing with educational prevention, rehabilitation and treatment measures.
Right. Chloe Wilson, do you take drugs?
I do. I take all sorts of drugs. I take the drugs which the government has chosen to support and which are the most dangerous drugs, those which kill hundreds of thousands of people every year, alcohol and tobacco, and also those which the state has chosen to condemn, specifically cannabis and ecstasy.
Now, you know it's against the law to take cannabis, ecstasy and other prohibited drugs. So why do you do it?
The basis of the law in this country is to protect people from each other, not from themselves. It's not for the state to decide what I do to my own body. I take those drugs because I enjoy them.
So the question of whether they're legal or not is irrelevant. The question is simply one of your personal choice.
Yes.
Donna Kabara, does the government have a responsibility to protect people from the consequences of what may be a bad choice for themselves?
No, people are entitled to go to hell in their own way, quite honestly. And they're not always necessarily going to hell. I find it outrageous that politicians should try to control adult choices about things that harm only the individuals concerned.
So you would say you would decriminalise all drugs?
Yes, I would. Yes, I would.
Despite the fact that they may be chemically proven to create a dependency?
Well, that is a matter for the individual. I mean, I'm not saying I necessarily approve of drug usage. I'm saying that there's enough information available for adults to be able to make choices which you or I may or may not regard as intelligent choices.
George Walden, when you were sitting in the House of Commons, hearing your colleagues like Barry Legg, as we heard in that report, talking about the horror of drugs, you're a responsible person. You've got to protect people from evil things, I suppose. What did you think?
First thing, a very fogyish reaction. I don't think that middle-aged people like myself should automatically try to ingratiate themselves with the young. That seems to me bad politics in a family as in the House of Parliament. Secondly, very pragmatic thought, driving up the M1, I'm not sure I'd be made any happier by the knowledge that a lot of drivers may be on a whole range of drugs. It's bad enough as it is. These are very simple thoughts, but I think practical thoughts. The third point is it's very important that Parliament should have an outspoken debate. My colleague here, in a position of much greater knowledge than I, has shown a great liberality of mind, so Parliament must do the same thing.
Ian Angel, are there other ways in which politicians tell people how to lead their lives that, in your view, they shouldn't be doing?
Politicians are control freaks. They really insist on running everything. I'm a firm believer in that every individual should make their own choices, but then take the responsibility for those choices.
But what about the consequences for other members of society of the kind that George Walden was just talking about? Someone who's out of their head on something, driving a car along the motorway.
Then they must pay the price, and they should take out insurance. There are other ways of doing it, rather than having politicians claiming they're going to stop it when they patently fail. So what's the point of saying these things when it doesn't work?
I think the real point is that prohibition doesn't work, and there are real benefits to be made from decriminalising drugs. Prohibition causes crime.
What is happening is the politicians want to interfere, yet take alcohol, for example, a far bigger problem than drugs, and yet there's no backup for people who are on the streets. What happens to the drunks on the streets?
But are you saying that politicians shouldn't even intervene to the extent of making it an offence to drive while drunk?
Not at all. Make it an offence and then actually follow up on it. And then you pay the price for doing it. You take responsibility.
Could I just intervene here and say, make 2 points. First of all, let's be very clear about something. When we say decriminalisation, we don't mean legalisation. I think there's a danger in mixing terminology. certainly I would be totally against any form of legalization of drugs. On the question of individual behavior, I think we have to accept that we live in a society and there are certain things that are harmful to society. And I believe that politicians do and governments do have a responsibility for seeing that harmful substances are not freely available on the streets. And that's why I'm against the issue of legalization. And where I think that the politicians have a responsibility also is providing the right sort of budgetary measures to deal with demand reduction. And at the moment, the only countries that have made these sort of figures, very recently, France. Of their entire budget spending on drug control, 75% is on the law enforcement action and only 25% on demand reduction. And this is where the imbalance is wrong. We need to spend more money on dealing with the question of education and so on. And I think we have a responsibility in that area.
Donna Kabar, are there other areas of government interference in the lives of the individual that you're unhappy about?
Yes, I mean, I'm unhappy about all types of what I describe as lifestyle fascism. I don't like the government interfering in, for example, the adult right to use pornography. I am not talking about child pornography here because the children concerned did not consent. I'm talking about the kind of pornography that involves adults and is consumed by adults. I'm not a great fan of it myself, but I don't see why my personal preferences should be imposed on other people.
So it doesn't worry you, I mean, if one took the view that it was degrading to women, that is no reason to ban it?
No.
If you took the view that it was associated sometimes with criminality, that is no reason to ban it?
Well,
the criminality may be wrong, but not necessarily the pornography.
That's right. The criminality per se is the problem, not the pornography. Well, the pornography per se is also a problem, depending on your tastes. But
you wouldn't ban it?
No. It's not my business, and it's not theirs.
Jack Straw, you're a lifestyle fascist, according to that point of view.
Well, I find some of this discussion based on a most curious proposition, which is that politicians are somehow detached from the rest of society, that we are a separate breed, when in fact we are elected to represent our constituents. Now, my views about drugs, as about a great deal else, are informed, so far as I'm able to be informed, by the views of my constituents. And if you take the issue of drug control or drug liberalisation, I've spent days, weeks, talking to people here in Blackburn about the effect of a rising abuse of drugs. And I don't just talk to the old fogies that George Walden talks about, I talk to a lot of the youngsters. I talk to those who've drifted into addiction, been over to Lytham St Anne's to talk to people in a very good hostel which is dealing with hard addicts who have often come out of prison. Now, very rarely do the people I'm talking to, the users, the parents, and indeed the police or magistrates, say to me the answer is for us to give up and forget about control, either to decriminalise or to legalise. Of course, we all have to recognise that drugs, the reason people take drugs initially is because they're attractive. But the problem is they have huge and very adverse long-term consequences. So I don't think it's fascism to seek to do something about those consequences and to say that the law, which is something which not just politicians demand, but the people we represent, namely voters, society, wishes to see in place, ought sensibly to be enforced.
In one sentence, why do you make drugs illegal?
Because, and we're not just talking about so-called recreational drugs, there's a huge range of drugs which are very powerful and very dangerous. Are people saying that we should make antibiotics, all sorts of other things, available over the counter?
No, the question
That's the issue.
No, the question is, why do you make these kind of drugs illegal?
Because they are potentially dangerous and therefore ought to be available only on prescription.
Well,
that's the point.
So is alcohol, but because politicians derive revenue from alcohol and tobacco, they seem to have no problem with alcohol and tobacco. Be consistent.
But there's a huge paradox here, surely. At the same time as people are becoming very concerned indeed about tobacco, and the move is at least towards controlling the use of tobacco, reducing its free availability and its free use. Some of the same people are saying, well, whilst we're very worried about tobacco and we ought to be moving towards controlling and reducing the use of tobacco, at the same time we should allow and permit the free use of all sorts of drugs, the full consequences of which are either very dangerous or for which we don't know what the final consequences will be, which include, for example, cannabis.
Figures came out this morning that 1 in 20 people in this country are alcohol abusers.
Yeah, well,
That's very serious. We ought to do something about that as well.
Let's not get hung up on this question of different kinds of drugs. It's the question that